I never thought a simple patch of grass could ruin my life. It started with a single warning letter. Then came the fines, the threats, and the board meetings that felt more like trials. My own neighbors turned against me over something so small, it's almost laughable now. Almost. But when I realized what the HOA president had been hiding, everything changed. What began as a petty dispute spiraled into a battle that exposed just how far people will go to protect their power. You think your neighborhood's rules keep things peaceful until they turn those rules against you. When Mark and his wife Dana moved into Willow Creek Estates, they thought they'd found their forever home. The cul-de-sac was quiet, the lawns were perfect, and the lake shimmered behind their backyard like something out of a postcard. After years of renting cramped apartments, this place felt like peace, predictable, safe, and steady. Their neighbors greeted them with polite smiles and the usual small talk. There was Carl from next door, who always trimmed his hedges twice a week, Linda, the HOA treasurer, who delivered the welcome packet with a tight grin, and, of course, Geraldine Parker, the HOA president, a woman who seemed to run the entire neighborhood like her own private kingdom. At first, Mark didn't think much of the rules. The HOA bylaws seemed reasonable enough. No loud parties, no unapproved paint colors, no parking on the street overnight. He signed the papers without reading every clause. It was, after all, a small price to pay for peace and quiet. The first few months were perfect. Mark spent his weekends fishing off the small dock behind his house, watching the sun melt into the lake as Dana gardened by the porch. They hosted quiet barbecues, waved to their neighbors, and finally felt like they belonged. But subtle things began to shift, things most people might have brushed off. A note taped to the mailbox reminding residents to keep decorative items minimal. A collective email from the HOA board recommending residents maintain uniform fencing styles. And once, during a casual conversation, Geraldine smiled and said, "We like to keep things consistent here." It didn't sound like a warning at the time. Then came the first notice, a mild one. A $50 fine for non-compliant property decor, referring to the small wooden bench Dana had painted bright teal near the garden. They laughed it off, assuming it was a clerical mistake. But a week later, another letter arrived, this time about Mark's small fishing setup on the dock. Unauthorized recreational equipment, it read. That's when the unease began to grow. Mark attended his first HOA meeting hoping to clear things up, but it was less a conversation and more an interrogation. Geraldine presided over the group from the end of a long conference table, surrounded by board members nodding at every word she said. When Mark tried to explain that the fishing rod wasn't equipment, just a hobby, she interrupted him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Rules are what keep this community beautiful," she said. "I'm sure you understand." By the time the meeting ended, Mark felt like he'd been publicly scolded. The other residents avoided eye contact as he walked out. From that moment, he started noticing how much power the HOA truly had. They decided which flowers could be planted, which mailboxes were acceptable, even what time holiday lights could go up. And behind every decision was Geraldine's signature. The neighborhood that once felt peaceful now felt like a stage, one where everyone was performing perfection, terrified of slipping up. Still, Mark tried to ignore it. He told himself it was just the price of living in a nice community. He'd follow the rules, keep his head down, and let things blow over. But then one quiet Sunday morning, he walked to the dock and saw something that made his stomach drop. The lake, the same water he'd fished from for months, was clouded and gray, with a strange chemical smell rising from its surface. And that was the moment Mark realized this wasn't about a fishing pole anymore. Mark stood on the dock, staring at the lake, the stench of chemicals thick in the air. The water had always been clear, glistening under the sunlight, but now it looked sickly, gray, almost dead. Fish floated near the surface, motionless, and a thin, oily film shimmered across the ripples. He knelt down, dipped his hand in, and immediately pulled back. The smell was sharp and artificial, like paint, thinner. Something was very wrong. By that afternoon, the neighborhood group chat was buzzing. People were asking why their sprinklers smelled strange, why the grass near the lakeshore was dying, why the geese had stopped landing there. The HOA's official response came quickly, a vague statement about routine lake treatment for algae control. But Mark knew this wasn't algae control. He'd seen proper treatments before. This was something else. He decided to attend the next HOA meeting. Maybe they'd explain, maybe someone would take responsibility. But when he arrived, the room was tense. Geraldine sat at the head of the table, her expression calm but cold. When Mark brought up the lake, she smiled and said everything was done according to environmental guidelines. He asked for the chemical report. She said it was private HOA documentation. He pressed again. It's our lake. We pay dues for its upkeep. Her smile didn't move. And those dues give us the authority to maintain it. That night, a new notice appeared taped to Mark's front door. A $200 fine for unapproved use of community facilities. The photo attached showed him kneeling by the dock. He felt his pulse quicken. They were watching him. Over the next few days, the harassment intensified. Anonymous complaints about unsightly fishing gear. Letters demanding he remove his dock pending compliance review. Even Dana's garden came under fire. Non-standard plant coloration. It was absurd. Every notice felt like a message. Stop asking questions. Mark tried to keep calm, but anger was building. Dana could see it in his eyes every time he checked the mailbox. Maybe you should just let it go, she whispered one night. It's not worth the stress, but Mark couldn't let it go. Not after seeing the lake die right behind his home. Not after realizing that Geraldine and her board were poisoning it, maybe to drive him out, maybe to hide something worse. He decided to fight back the only way he could, met with proof. He began documenting everything. Photos, emails, timestamps. He filed a public records request for the HOA's lake maintenance contracts. He even reached out to a local environmental agency. Weeks passed. Then one morning, a manila envelope appeared in his mailbox. No return address. Inside was a photocopy of a purchase order from the HOA, dated 2 weeks before the lake incident. The order listed a chemical compound called trimethyl aquafix, a restricted-use herbicide banned in residential water systems. Mark's stomach turned. They hadn't just over-treated the lake, they'd used something illegal. That night, he brought the document to the next HOA meeting. The board members shifted uncomfortably as he laid the papers on the table. I know what you dumped in the lake, Mark said, his voice steady. And I know you didn't file the environmental notice required by the county. Geraldine didn't flinch. You're mistaken, she said softly. That document is private property. You have no right to possess it. The room went silent. Mark met her eyes. No, Geraldine, you have no right to poison the water behind my home. She stood slowly, smoothing the front of her blazer. This meeting is adjourned. As Mark left, he could feel everyone's eyes on him. Some fearful, some supportive, most just silent. The next morning, his mailbox was empty. No fines, no notes, nothing. For a moment, he thought maybe she'd back down. Then he found out the HOA had filed a formal complaint against him for harassment and misconduct at an official meeting. They even threatened legal action if he continued to spread false claims. It wasn't just intimidation anymore. It was war. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some residents started whispering support. Others avoided Mark entirely, afraid to be seen on his side. Then something unexpected happened. Carl, his quiet next-door neighbor, knocked on his door late one night holding a USB drive. I shouldn't be giving you this, Carl said nervously, but people deserve to know. On the drive were internal HOA emails, copies of conversations between Geraldine and the board about the lake treatment. One line made Mark's blood run cold. Once the water is treated, residents will be discouraged from fishing or using the dock area. It's a liability we no longer want to manage. They had done it intentionally. They'd poisoned the lake to stop him and anyone else from using it. Mark took the evidence to the environmental agency he'd contacted earlier. Within a week, county inspectors arrived at Willow Creek. They took samples, snapped photos, and quietly interviewed residents. The HOA tried to downplay it, calling it routine oversight. But panic was spreading fast. When the preliminary report came back, it confirmed everything. The lake had been contaminated with illegal chemicals, and the HOA was responsible. But Geraldine wasn't finished. She held an emergency community meeting, accusing Mark of leaking false information and damaging property values. She painted him as a troublemaker, a bitter homeowner trying to stir chaos. Standing at the back of that meeting, listening to her lies echo across the room, Mark felt something inside him snap. He realized there was no reasoning with her. No compromise that would make her stop. The only way to end this was to expose her completely. So he did. He contacted the local news, handed over every document, every photo, every email. When the story aired, it exploded. Local HOA under investigation for poisoning lake, the headline read. By morning, reporters were parked outside the subdivision. Cameras lined the street. Residents who had once whispered behind curtains now stood in driveways, talking openly for the first time. Geraldine tried to spin it, releasing a statement about misunderstandings and rogue contractors. inspectors. But it was too late. The Saib County had already filed a formal citation against the HOA. A full audit was underway, and for the first time in months, Mark slept peacefully. But the fight wasn't over yet. One evening, a week after the story broke, Mark received a call from an unknown number. A quiet voice on the other end said, "You don't know me, but thank you. What you did, it's helping more people than you realize." Then the line went dead. He didn't know who it was, but he knew what it meant. The truth was finally spreading, and soon, Geraldine Parker was about to face the consequences. The morning the investigation report was released, the air around Willow Creek felt different. The same quiet cul-de-sac that once buzzed with sprinklers and morning joggers now buzzed with whispers and camera shutters. News vans lined the entry gate. Reporters with microphones paced near the community center, waiting for someone, anyone, to comment. Mark watched it all from his living room window, coffee cup trembling in his hand. The story had gone viral overnight. Local media had picked it up, then regional, and now national. He had wanted accountability, not chaos. But chaos had arrived anyway. Across the street, Geraldine Parker's blinds were drawn. The woman who used to march through the neighborhood like she owned every blade of grass was suddenly nowhere to be seen. Her pristine SUV sat unused in the driveway, its silver hood speckled with pollen. By noon, the HOA called an urgent special meeting, open to all residents. Mark didn't plan to go at first. He was tired, drained, but then he saw the post on the community forum. All members are encouraged to attend to discuss potential dissolution of current board leadership. That was it. The moment everything had been building toward, the meeting hall was packed. The hum of voices echoed like static. Rows of folding chairs filled every inch of the small space. People stood against the walls, clutching printouts, screenshots, copies of fines. The air was electric, charged with weeks, months, years of resentment finally boiling over. At the front of the room, the HOA board sat behind a long table, Geraldine in the middle, her smile gone but her posture still rigid, proud. To her right sat the treasurer, avoiding eye contact. To her left, the secretary fidgeted with her pen. Mark took a seat near the aisle. He could feel the tension thrum through the floor. When Geraldine finally stood, her voice was tight. "Let's begin," she said, tapping the microphone. "I know there have been concerns." A few people laughed bitterly. She continued, "Recent media coverage has presented a very misleading picture of this association and its intentions. The chemical treatment of the lake was approved and performed by certified professionals. The suggestion that the HOA acted unlawfully is completely false." Mark's jaw clenched. He could feel his heart pounding. A man from the back stood up. "Then why did the county fine you? Why did the EPA confirm the contamination?" Geraldine's expression hardened. "Sir, I won't be shouted down. We have documentation proving everything was handled properly." Mark couldn't take it anymore. He rose from his seat. "Show it then," he said. "Show the documentation." The room went silent. Dozens of eyes turned toward him. Geraldine stared at him for a long moment, then gave a thin, almost pitying smile. "Mr. Bennett," she said slowly, "you've done enough damage. Maybe you should sit down before you embarrass yourself further." But Mark didn't move. Instead, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a folder, thick, worn, full of papers. He laid it on the front table. "These are the emails," he said. "The purchase orders," the contractor quotes, "every one of them signed by you." He turned toward the audience. "She didn't just poison the lake. She lied about it and fined residents who asked questions. Then used our dues to hire lawyers to silence us." The treasurer buried his face in his hands. The secretary froze. Gasps rippled through the room. Geraldine's voice shook for the first time. "You obtained those illegally." "No," Mark said quietly. "They were leaked by someone on your board who finally got tired of covering for you." A murmur rose among the crowd. Cameras clicked. Someone started recording on their phone. Geraldine tried to speak again, but her microphone cut out. The sound tech shrugged. The crowd was no longer listening anyway. They were standing, yelling, demanding resignations. It was like a dam breaking. Years of pent-up frustration crashing all at once. "You fined me for a bird bath," one woman shouted. "You threatened to tow my car for parking in my own driveway," yelled another. Geraldine's voice was drowned out. Her authority, her calm, her carefully built facade, all crumbling under the weight of the truth. Mark stood still, watching it unfold. It wasn't satisfaction he felt, not exactly, more like release. For the first time, he wasn't the one being accused. He was being heard. When the shouting finally died down, the treasurer leaned into his microphone, voice trembling. "I move that we vote for immediate removal of the current HOA president." The room erupted again, but this time, with applause. Geraldine looked stunned, pale. "You can't do this," she whispered. But they could, and they did. By a near unanimous vote, the board voted to remove her. Geraldine Parker, the woman who ruled Willow Creek for 7 years, was done. She stood abruptly, gathered her papers, and stormed out through the side door. Flashes from cameras following her as she disappeared into the afternoon sun. Mark exhaled slowly, sinking into his chair. The crowd was still buzzing, people shaking his hand, thanking him, patting his shoulder. but all he could think about was the lake. He walked out of the hall, down the familiar path to the water's edge. The sun was setting, gold streaks across the surface. The smell was cleaner now, faint but improving. The county had begun cleanup efforts that morning. He knelt on the dock, fingertips skimming the water. For the first time in months, it didn't sting. Behind him, Dana approached quietly. "She's gone," she said softly. "For good." Mark nodded. "Yeah." They stood there together in silence, the fading orange light reflecting on the ripples, the same place where it had all begun. And as the wind moved across the water, Mark realized something he hadn't before. He hadn't just fought for his property. He'd fought for everyone who'd ever been bullied into silence by people who hid behind rules and power. The sound of laughter echoed faintly from across the lake. Kids tossing stones, their voices bright against the quiet. It felt like peace returning. But just as Mark turned to leave, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. It read, "She's not done yet." He froze. His heart skipped once. Then again, he looked around the darkening shoreline. The neighborhood was quiet, but something about that message lingered, like a warning. Was it just paranoia or something more? He didn't know, but he knew this story wasn't quite over. And deep down, part of him wasn't sure it ever would be. For days after the meeting, Willow Creek was caught in a strange silence. Lawns still gleamed, sprinklers still ticked in the morning. But something invisible had shifted, like the neighborhood was holding its breath. Geraldine Parker had vanished. Her SUV was gone, her blinds stayed drawn, and her nameplate was quietly removed from the HOA bulletin board. The new acting president, a timid man named Charles Dunn, sent out a carefully worded email thanking residents for their patience during the leadership transition. But beneath the polished language, everyone knew what it really meant. The reign of fear was over. At least, that's what they wanted to believe. Mark tried to go back to normal. He rebuilt his dock, repainted the bench Dana had once been forced to remove, and started fishing again. The first time he cast his line into the lake after the cleanup, the water was clear enough to see the pebbles below. It felt symbolic, like the neighborhood was cleansing itself. One ripple at a time. Neighbors who used to avoid him now stopped to chat. Some even apologized. "I should have said something sooner," one man admitted. "I didn't realize how bad it was until you stood up," another said. For the first time in a long time, Mark didn't feel like an outsider, but the text still haunted him. "She's not done yet." At first, he dismissed it as a cruel prank, maybe someone trying to stir things up again. But a few weeks later, strange things started happening. It began with paperwork. The HOA's new management company sent out statements showing missing funds, thousands of dollars unaccounted for, legal fees, consultation expenses, and environmental adjustments paid to shell companies that didn't seem to exist. Every trail led back to Geraldine. Then came the rumors. Someone spotted her car outside the county courthouse. Another swore they'd seen her having lunch with a local developer, the same one who had tried to buy parcels of land around the lake 2 years earlier. At first, no one wanted to believe it, but when a zoning proposal appeared in city planning records requesting the conversion of part of Willow Creek's common area into commercial use, the truth began to surface. Geraldine wasn't gone. She was trying to take the neighborhood down from the outside. Mark could have ignored it. He'd already done his part. The board was restructured. The residents were awake now, and his life was finally calm again. But something in him refused to let it go. Maybe it was principle. Maybe it was the quiet anger that still lived in his chest every time he thought of what she'd done. So he started digging again. This time, he worked quietly, gathering records, cross-referencing names, building a trail that pointed toward a bigger scheme. It turned out Geraldine had been planning to sell access rights to the lake, the same lake she'd poisoned, to a developer in exchange for a private payout. The treatment project that had contaminated the water wasn't negligence, it was sabotage. She had been trying to kill the lake to justify draining it, making the land usable for construction. The community she claimed to protect was never her priority. It was a stepping stone. When Mark presented the findings to the county, the response was immediate. Investigators reopened the case. The developer backed out within days, and Geraldine, once untouchable, found herself facing charges for fraud and environmental damage. The arrest was quiet, but word spread fast. By sunset, everyone knew. That night, Mark sat on his porch, watching the reflection of the moon on the lake. Dana joined him, handing him a mug of coffee. "It's over now," she said softly. Mark smiled faintly. "Maybe, or maybe it's just over for us." She looked at him, puzzled. He gestured toward the row of identical houses stretching down the street. "This isn't the only place like this. There are thousands of neighborhoods run by people just like her, people who think power makes them untouchable." Dana nodded, staring out at the water. "Then maybe someone else will stand up the way you did." In the weeks that followed, the community transformed. Residents voted to amend the HOA bylaws, limiting board terms, requiring public disclosure of finances, and banning unilateral decisions without member approval. For the first time, people felt like they had a voice. Meetings became gatherings instead of interrogations. Kids played by the lake again. Someone even even painted a small sign by the dock. No fishing fines allowed. It became a joke, a symbol of what they'd overcome. Mark laughed every time he saw it, but deep down, he knew what it represented. Freedom. Months later, a letter arrived in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a photograph of the lake taken at dawn. The water was calm, glass-like, and beneath it, a handwritten note. "You were right to fight for it." Mark read it twice. There was no malice in the handwriting, just a strange finality. A goodbye, maybe, or an admission. He didn't tell anyone about it. He just folded it back into the envelope and slipped it into a drawer. That evening, he took his boat out one last time before winter. The air was cold, but the sky was clear. He watched the ripples fan out across the lake, slow and steady, disappearing into the horizon, and for the first time, he didn't feel angry anymore. Still, the battle was over, but the lesson remained, because HOAs don't just exist to keep grass trimmed or paint colors uniform. They're reflections of something deeper, the human urge to control, to dominate, to define what's acceptable. But every rule, every signature, every fine only holds power until someone decides not to bow to it anymore. And when that happens, when one person stands up, even against an entire board, that's when real change begins. Mark didn't see himself as a hero. He was just a homeowner who refused to be silenced. But sometimes that's all it takes to turn a quiet neighborhood rebellion into something bigger. Something that reminds people that fairness isn't granted by policy. It's claimed by courage. The camera pans out, the lake gleaming in the morning light, kids laughing on the dock, the neighborhood alive again, peace restored, but not forgotten. And as the narration fades, one final line echoes. They poisoned the water to control him. But in the end, his fight cleansed more than the lake. It cleansed the community. Fade to black.